Okay, once again, good evening, everyone. My name is Gib Vacconi, and I'm with the Prospect Heights Neighborhood Development Council, a member of the Brooklyn Speaks Coalition. On behalf of the coalition, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's panel discussion, Public-Private Development is Failing the Public. How can we fix it? I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for this evening, Voices of the Waterfront and the City Club of New York, and acknowledge the members of the Brooklyn Speaks Coalition, which are the Atlantic Avenue Local Development Corporation, the Boerum Hill Association, the Brooklyn Heights Association, Brown Community Development Corporation, CNU NYC, Diaspora Community Services, the Fifth Avenue Committee, the Park Slope Civic Council, Impact Brooklyn, the North Flatbush Business Improvement District, and the Prospect Heights Neighborhood Development Council. New York City and New York State governments increasingly turn to public-private partnerships, or P3s, to deliver public goods like affordable housing, job creation, public infrastructure, and open space. But the history of P3s in New York State has been mixed. In Brooklyn, the Atlantic Yards project was approved in 2006 to remove blight caused by open rail yards along Vanderbilt Avenue. 20 years later, the rail yards remain uncovered, promised affordable housing was not completed by a May 2025 deadline, and the state declined to collect damages from the developer, which were intended to make up for the unfinished apartments. Now, with a new plan being considered for Atlantic Yards, as well as a new government-sponsored development being planned for the Red Hook waterfront, we look forward to tonight's discussion among experts in planning, development, and government accountability. One unfortunate note, State Senator April Baskin is not feeling well this evening and is not able to join us. We had invited her to speak on legislation she's introduced to improve compliance with public commitments from P3s, and we appreciate her help in planning this panel. We also wish her a speedy recovery. Our moderator for this evening's discussion is Laura Wolfe Powers. Dr. Wolfe Powers is a professor of urban policy and planning at the School of Arts and Sciences at City University of New York Hunter College and a member of the faculty in Earth and Environmental Sciences at the CUNY Graduate Center. She teaches economic development, real estate development, community planning, and political economy. She's an associate editor of the Journal of the American Planning Association and co-editorial director of metropolitics.org, an online journal of public scholarship on cities and urban politics. Dr. Wolfe Powers, thank you for joining us, and I'll turn things over to you.
Great. Thanks, Gib. It's a real honor to moderate this august panel here. I think I want to start by saying a few things about the P3 projects that Gib was describing. He did a very good job of talking about the fraught history of these in New York and naming a few examples. But I just want to say about mega projects that they have some important characteristics that it's worth keeping in mind. These are projects that are influencing the built environment at the scale of the city and the region. So they have certainly community impacts on the surrounding area, but they also are generating economic outcomes and effects that are citywide and regional. They have very long investment time horizons, 10 to 30 years, sometimes more. And they require very large quantities of public and private capital, high front-end investments in land and infrastructure, and political risk-taking and resources, and entrepreneurship on the part of those who are partnering to sponsor them. So it's not, the government role here is very prominent. They could not take place without the government, and often they are enacted through special purpose governments, aka authorities or development corporations. And those entities have some real advantages in that they are somewhat insulated from the rough and tumble of the political process. They can bond and borrow money without, overshooting the state debt cap. They also have some disadvantages, which are they sort of mirror images of their advantages, in that they are not as accountable to members of the public and elected officials, whether those are members of the city council or the state legislature. Struggle to to provide oversight, and to keep them to the kinds of commitments that you often see made at the beginning when the political negotiations are happening. There are promises about open space and promises about affordability of housing and promises about small business development and participation among historically marginalized workers and businesses. And in the implementation phase, that can easily fall by the wayside, and the elected officials have not as much recourse as they would like. I'm really sorry that Senator Baskin isn't able to be here tonight, because during the preparation for this webinar, she was able to relate a motivation for legislation that she recently introduced, that I found very compelling. So she represents District 63 in the New York State Senate. It's Buffalo, Cheektowaga metropolitan area. And it's in her district that the Buffalo Bills stadium, the new Buffalo Bills stadium, is being built. In the context of that, she negotiated a community benefits agreement. She has had a series of travails attempting to hold the Bills organization to the commitments that they made. And she actually, this motivated her to create a division of post-construction compliance, or a proposal for a division of post-construction compliance within the state government. And she was really imagining an entity that has the independence and the capacity to enforce community reinvestment commitments that are negotiated in the context of P3 projects, beyond the construction phase and into the operating phase. The story that she tells is a very interesting one, and I think her legislation is something that everybody who's interested in accountable development in New York State should try to follow as it moves through committee and possibly onto the floor of the legislature later this spring. I actually wanted to introduce Moses Gates now and ask my first question of him. Moses is the Vice President for Housing and Neighborhood Planning at the Regional Plan Association. He is a former visiting assistant professor at Pratt Institute, and he has also worked at the Association of Neighborhood and Housing Development, which is a sort of trade association for affordable housing developers and neighborhood revitalization organizations in New York City. So Moses, you're now at the Regional Plan Association, and I think my question for you is, what kinds of public benefits is it appropriate to expect of these P3 projects? There's a lot of there's a general assumption that in addition to throwing off tax revenue, these projects really ought to have a kind of public mission, serve public needs, however those are defined. And do you think that? Well, I'll start with that question. What are the kinds of benefits that it's appropriate to expect of these sorts of projects? You're muted.
Muted. So I definitely want to make the point that I think it's appropriate to expect anything, because you're doing a bilateral negotiation and the public is part of that negotiation. And what the public wants is going to be reflected in their choices of elected officials, or maybe even just the zeitgeist in the air. And I don't want to say anything that happens to be something that the public wants from a project is illegitimate or wrong. It's a negotiation. Everything should be on the table in a negotiation. I think some things are a lot easier to expect and a lot more likely to make it through the process than others. And I kind of break those into two different categories. I work for Regional Plan Association, and in my heart, I am a planner. And I think that the planning and design elements in these P3s are to some extent a little bit of the easiest thing to negotiate and the easiest thing to expect in terms of urban design, in terms of public amenities. And I think we have a pretty decent track record with this and a track record of delivering these. And I think that we do really well on the design and public benefit side of things when we crowdsource it in the city as much as possible. One of the best examples was the World Trade Center development, where we really did, and RPA was a big part of this, a very extensive citywide engagement process to try to find out both the elements and even digging down into the specifics of what the public really wanted in terms of memorials, in terms of open space, in terms of site design. And, these are things that different people have different opinions on, and they end up contentious. And somebody's urban design cup of tea is not another person's, and that's okay. But I think that the fact that we did all of that public engagement results in a development that on the urban design level, people is a hit. People appreciate and has been done well. And importantly, we front loaded that design. And that's the other part of kind of accountable development. You can front load a lot of the design in the public space and the public amenities part of things. And, in the World Trade Center example, we did the museum, we did the public entities, we did the memorial, and the buildings, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're still not done building the buildings. It's the kind of thing where front loading those public amenities has a proven track record, is a little bit easier, especially in the urban design side of things. And I think is where there's a lot of element for success. The other part to it is the financial part. The financial part is tougher. And you point out the idea that a big part of P3s is raising property value, which raises money that the public can then recoup in tax revenue or in other ways through other means, whether that's through wanting the affordable housing, wanting the union jobs, wanting other things that have like a real financial hit on the developer. And that's not to say the design element doesn't have a financial hit, but it's something that a lot of times that public benefit can really outweigh the amount of money that it takes. And it's in negotiating the monetary side of the P3 that I think things are a lot trickier. And I think that the track record of maintaining that and making sure that it all comes through the other end the same way it was proposed is a lot shakier. And I expect we'll talk a lot more about that as we kind of go on with the panel.
Thank you, Moses. I think I want to go to Elizabeth Marcello next. Elizabeth is my colleague at Hunter College. She's in her doctoral dissertation explored how Empire State Development, the state entity, how the activities of that organization can sometimes conflict with some of the normative ideals that we have as planners of democratic planning. And Elizabeth is also a policy fellow at Reinvent Albany, which is a watchdog organization. She's studied many different kinds of public authorities and followed a lot of projects. So I think, Liz, if you want to sort of maybe reflect a little bit on what Moses just talked about in terms of the the sort of design aspects versus the financial aspects of public commitments that might be made in a P3. I think that would be useful. And also, I think if Senator Baskin was here, she would really be doubling down on the idea that we need to have more meaningful oversight of public authorities and the projects that they're initiating, because they are not, whatever commitments they make, with respect to, generating value beyond the revenue that is generated, are often kind of abandoned and with very little sort of consequence. So perhaps you could speak to
Sure.
the kinds of things that people have suggested in terms of alternative oversight mechanisms.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Laura, and thanks to Gib for putting this together and for including me. I really appreciate this question. And, I think if Senator Baskin were here, she would have talked a lot about, as you said, Laura, her proposal for the state entity to sort of do for post-construction enforcement or accountability, right? And so, right, this idea that we're going to create this new thing to force public authorities, namely ESD, to actually do what they're supposed to do, which is act in the public interest, I think is pretty interesting. And as you said, Reinvent Albany has done a lot of work on accountability. And I, from the work that I've done with Reinvent Albany and other scholarship, I don't agree that we need to go out and make a new entity, because I think there are many mechanisms that already exist within state government and some within local governments to actually make ESD deliver projects in the name of the public interest. And so along these lines, I have two major points to make. And the first is that I want to point out a big problem, which is that public authority officials, and I'm mostly thinking about Empire State Development here, that includes their staff and their board members, they simply don't obey New York State Public Authorities law. They don't obey public officers law. And both of these things establish clear expectations for ethical and transparent behavior. Right. And this is like basic urban planning, right? Like the government is the public's business, and we have a right to know what's going on. This is a basic part of democracy and democratic planning. But ESD directors and staff regularly dodge reasonable questions from the public and journalists. They game legal exceptions to avoid or delay disclosing records under our state's Freedom of Information law. Like a big example, and I know I see Norman Oder is one of the attendees, and I follow his watchdogging of Atlantic Yards, and so I know that he has noticed this as well, right? ESC, they don't have to respond to public comment. They actually post board meetings so close to a public meeting that the public doesn't even have time to review and respond accordingly. These are very basic things that I think the legislature could hold ESD accountable for, even now without the creation of any new entity, and I don't see them doing these things. The second major point I think is important to note here is that we already have great watchdogs within government that serve as a check and balance on routine government agencies. And these checks and balances could be extended to ESD, right? Watchdogs can force some level of transparency and accountability, right? We have a comptroller's office. I love the state comptroller. It would be great if the comptroller's office conducted more regular audits of ESD programs and projects. I think they do great work, but there are over 1,000 public authorities in New York State doing all manner of things. So, maybe the legislature should ask themselves, like, what can we do to empower and enable the comptroller to do more work, right? Another watchdog we have in government is the authority's budget office. The ABO is so underfunded and understaffed, it's like practically a joke of an office, right? What if we had a fully funded ABO that could conduct a governance and operational report of ESD? I will also note that it would be great if the head of the ABO was not appointed by the governor. And we already know that public authorities largely do the bidding of the governor. So, that's an issue for another day. Thinking more about what the legislature could do, more proactive with audits. As an example, the legislature mandated a couple years ago under the leadership of Senator Skoufis that the Department of Tax and Finance conduct an independent audit of the state's tax incentive programs. And that audit found that the state's film and TV tax credit, only like for every dollar we spend on that tax credit, we got 31 cents in terms of like direct, indirect, and induced economic impacts. 31 cents, right? So this makes me wonder, like, what if we did a forensic audit of, I don't know, Atlantic Yards? We have a great New York City independent budget office here. We have great organizations like Brooklyn Speaks. We have, as I said before, Norman Oder, who's like a gift to New York City, right? all these other groups are working on these issues, but I want the state legislature, right, to stand up and demand answers on behalf of the public, right? The legislature could do more work to hold boards of directors accountable to their fiduciary duty to the public and the authority. I don't have time to get into it here, right? But the fact that the board of ESD approved the Penn Station redevelopment with so little financial information available to the public, that's just bananas, right? And then the state's Public Authority Control Board, which is made up of members of the legislature, approved it, right? So anyway, circling back to my original point, the bottom line is that all these public authorities, ESD is the big one in my crosshairs, right? They get away with this because I think the average New Yorker has no idea what's going on, right? The fact that public authorities act in total darkness and outside of public view and comprehension even, yet have so much power, it's shocking, right? And Laura, I appreciate you highlighting this at the outset of your talk, right? It's like, why don't people know who or what ESD is? Why is their website so hard to use? Why is it so hard to find information about what they're doing? Why don't we know the total amount of public money, which is like our tax dollars, that have gone to individual businesses over the decades, right? Like, the legislature has the power to ask for these things. And so I think we should be thinking a lot about how we can create a state in which all people can plan and control their own spaces. I'm pretty tired of the meaningless community participation exercises like community advisory committees and community benefits agreements, right? Which often amount to like bribes for community buy-in. But, what are the benefits to the public? So, beyond generating revenue, we need to do some hard thinking about what we want as a community in New York State, the future we want to build. And I think public stewardship is important, but it's also about a transparent, responsible, democratic government that acts in the public interest and moves beyond, revenue generation. So I'll just stop there because I'm getting very passionate, but I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Liz. And I think that you've provided a really excellent segue into the next question that I have, which is for John Shapiro. I think that you're when you're talking about the performance in terms of the delivery of P3 projects, you really are interested in the production of social value in addition to revenue generation. And the question of what that social value is a very complicated one, and it does require quite a bit of democratic deliberation. You can't really arrive at it simply by having a few members of the community write on Post-it notes and put them on a wall. I mean, there's really difficult questions about trade-offs and about what is the value if we are going to provide such a high degree of subsidy for projects, what are the terms on which those entitlements are extended. And John Shapiro is a professor at Pratt Institute, and he was the former chair of the Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment there, and before that he was a principal at Phillips Price Shapiro Associates, which is an urban planning consultancy. So his work has touched an enormous proportion of the projects that we all associate with New York planning, and he is part of the City Club of New York, which was one of the sponsors of this panel. And he recently authored with David Burney, former member of the City Planning Commission, an article in Common Edge that really kind of got at some of these questions about social value and proposed reforms to environmental quality review that involved consciously widening the conception of what a public-private partnership agreement is supposed to do and how it should function. So I want to invite John to talk a little bit about what he proposed and also talk about how whether he agrees with Liz that an important vector for pursuing those reforms would be a more active state legislature. John.
Sure. Yes, I do agree with Liz. So thank you very much. So David and I co-authored this piece, and maybe there's a way to put it into the chat or into the list of questions, a link to it. And it basically said, look, EIS and fiscal impact analyses are too late. We need to have a social impact analysis or ideation from the very start in a project. And this would add transparency and broaden the benefits and make them longer lasting. This is such a low-hanging fruit that I think the real answer is why isn't it already being done? And I think it has to do with the order of things and how we might benefit from upsetting that order. And I'm going to suggest 6 ideas. It could be any one of these. It could be none of these. If it was all 6 of them, there's something wrong because all ideas are not worthy of pursuing. But just as a way of getting provocations going and people thinking, first, New York City has no comprehensive plan. That means the mayor rules. There's no document that measures what our public needs or objectives. That mayor's term of office is less than the length of these projects. So first, having a comp plan that sets out what the public objectives are, it means, yeah, those at the mega project negotiation table must defer. There'll be less revenue for this or less for that, but it's what represents the city's best interests over time, not just at a snapshot in time. Second, there's the question of who's the lead agency. Right now in New York City, P3 is controlled by the Economic Development Corporation, EDC. It's the mayor's agency. It's not the city's agency. It does not have an obligation to consult or follow, I should say, what the city's plan is, because there is no plan. Now, it also means that the revenue that goes into EDC is really mainly at the disposal of the mayor. And I actually think it's great that the executive has a sluff fund. But what it does mean is that the agencies too often see these projects just as a developer would. How do we maximize either the size and revenue of this project at minimum public exposure and expense? So that analysis, from my point of view, needs an independent sponsor or a co-sponsor. Yes, it could be the controller. The project needs a co-sponsor. It could be any number of agencies. But with my own bias, it would be the City Planning Commission. Third, there's the question of implementation strategy. Battery Park City illustrates how to do it right. Atlantic Yards illustrates how to do it wrong. When it's a single developer like Atlantic Yards, the city is a prisoner of that one developer's capacity, marketing ideas, financing, ambitions, leadership, ability to be flexible as markets and interest rates and other things change, and also a prisoner of the ability of that developer to just walk away because they're measuring their investments year by year. Does it pay off for us to keep doing this? Well, the city is thinking out in the long term, will the whole thing get done? So at the negotiating table, when at Hudson Yards, they say we need an extra $2 billion because of COVID and we can't pay for the platform anymore, the city has to come up with the money. It's not a sunk cost for the developer anymore, as it would be if it was a private development. Battery Park City, on the other hand, illustrates how to do it right. They came up with the plan, and then they sold the parcels one by one with strict expectations about what would be achieved with the revenue or the design of each of the buildings. Fourth, there's a question of time, and this relates to Moses's point. The promises made by one mayor are not the political or even necessarily the legitimate promises of the next mayor. Mayors change their priorities. By the time 2 terms of office have passed, in addition, the opposition, stakeholders, press, and public attention have shifted to the topic of the day. So it's very hard for the likes of Gib Facconi and his organization to keep reminding the world that there's broken promises when the world has moved on to a new crisis from the one that it had 20 years ago. So it's too easy to break these promises. So, I think one solution, which we can learn from which community benefit agreements work and which ones don't, such as the West Philadelphia one that Laura has studied, which works very well, is each phase should be subject to its own approval process. And I would suggest that the city is the guarantor, not the developer, that the city, or if it's the state is the guarantor of whatever those public benefits are, that it's in their capital budget, that it's in the comprehensive plan, so that there's a necessity to amend the plan in a public way before breaking a promise. Which brings me to the last point. And this goes against the spirit of the moment, and with all apologies to Ezra Klein, who I otherwise love. I think we should accept controversy. ULURP is an advisory process. No one in ULURP has promised until the final rounds between the mayor and the city council, and for specific projects, the mayor and the borough presidents. Anything, everything anyone else brings up is actually only there to help understand the trade-offs. And everything always has trade-offs. It takes time. Let's say it's 2 to 3 years. That's the normal approval process in the rest of the nation for high impact projects. In fact, it's the normal time frame for all development. New York City is the only city I know that says as of right, it's not about yield, it's about everything, such that 85% of what gets built in New York City, 85% of the buildings that get built in New York City are only subject to administrative review. Frankly, our development community is simply spoiled. Mega projects have mega expectations, mega impacts, mega politics. They should be controversial. If they're not controversial, we're not thinking hard enough. And not that they should be thwarted, but I have yet to find a community process or a review process that has not improved projects, so long as the discussion is realistic, up to date, and there's trust, which broken promises repeatedly over and over again does not create. So David and I basically called for broader ideation and transparency. Like I said, that to me is sort of like the only reason not to do that is fear of that your ideas aren't strong enough. And even as the other ideas that I've suggested just now are about trying to shift the incentives away from the maximization of the single agencies and mayors' singular interests, all of which are relatively short term, one term, maybe 2 terms, to a longer view of what's to the benefit to the city and to the community. And I'll pass it on.
Thank you, John. It's given us a lot to think about here, and there are questions beginning to pile up in the chat. So I'm excited to engage some of the audience members as well. But first, I want to introduce Raju Mann. Raju is the president and chief executive officer of the Battery Park City Authority, and he previously has had a number of positions, including at the design and engineering firm Arup, and also at the city council, where he was the director of land use and deputy chief of staff. So Raju, I'm going to ask you a question that pertains to your current role at the Battery Park City Authority. I know that your organization has obligations to a lot of different stakeholders, the residents of Battery Park City, landowners, bondholders who issued the debt on which the authority functions, and also the general public, people who use the park, who benefit from the revenue that you share with the city's general fund. So based on that experience, how would you evaluate some of the ideas that our panelists have put forward?
Great. Hi, Laura. And hello, everyone out there. Yeah, I think I would take a slightly different perspective. I think one sort of broad question here that's surfacing is how do we hold agencies accountable to promises, right? I think that seems to be one of the framing questions. And I would take the slightly different take, which is how do we make sure these projects happen the way they are intended to happen? And so, if you look at the research on mega projects, which I think is the class of projects we're talking about roughly here, we're not talking about your sort of average 90-unit affordable housing development. Um, and you look at the research, and there's this guy, Ben Fluberg, who maybe some of your audience knows. I'm sure John does, and others. He's written this book on mega projects, and he actually went through and looked at, thousands of mega projects to understand what were the common challenges they face. And 9 out of 10 have significant cost overruns, for example. So this is a global study of mega projects. Um, and so I think his point, and he's got a bunch of sort of defining characteristics around these. One of them is this sort of optimism bias that he talks a lot about in his work, which is the sense that everybody wants to get excited about what these projects can represent. Everybody wants to get excited about the new airport or high-speed rail in California. And so there's an optimism bias around the delivery of these projects, around the schedules and costs that are originally projected that really trickle through from elected officials to agencies to the public. And so I think the way that I think about it is more not how do we hold folks accountable. Obviously, that's a hugely important point, but it's how do we make sure we actually are set up for success in the delivery of these projects, and how do we learn from the projects around the world that are struggling with the same issues that we're struggling with here, and get better at large project delivery, which I think is a bit more of a technocratic and project management exercise than purely a political one. I think it does require, increasing capacity of city agencies. I think it requires a very engaged public to understand what trade-offs actually mean and represent. It requires elected officials to resist the temptation to announce something before it's fully thought through. It requires some real psychological shifts in our thinking around these projects, and also some real technocratic shifts in our thinking around these projects. And so I think it's a little bit less in my mind purely about the accountability question and more about how do we do the project delivery side of it. And I say this is, we finished up a park over the summer that was, close to $300 million that we opened in the southern end of Battery Park City, Wagner Park, and we're starting a 5-year, $2 billion resiliency project right now. So 5 years of construction ahead. And so, these are very live questions, at least in my mind, is how do we make sure that we are set up to deliver the projects that we say we're trying to deliver. And then there's a whole discussion around project delivery models and all of that, which we can talk to, which again is a bit more technocratic. So I think that's my slight reframe of this conversation, at least in my mind. And I think there's a lot of good lessons to learn from mega projects around the world, and I can drop in some of the links in the chat about some of this research. And I guess I would highlight the optimism bias as one in particular that I think is really seductive for all of us. The other point, and to John's, John, I love the credit for Battery Park City, and thank you for that. But I wanted to interject a little bit of cool water into that. So, the authority was created in 1968. The first building got built and opened in 1982. So it was 14 years later that the first buildings got built. In 68, there was an affordable housing contracts for the neighborhood that was very different. It was supposed to be 1/3 low-income housing. When the building started being built in 1982, the economy had changed. New York was recovering from the 70s, and that was a promise that could no longer be kept in 82, but was made in 68. And I don't think that was because there was a failure to hold people accountable. I think it was a changing economy in the 70s that nobody could project that the city was on the verge of bankruptcy. And so I think there's also I think for projects of this scale over these durations, there are ebbs and flows in market cycles, political cycles, economic cycles that are hard to predict at the outset. And so I think there's some humility I think we should all have in venturing into these kinds of efforts, but also in criticizing them, because I do think that there are unforeseen events that it's very, very hard to plan for. And I think the question, if you looked at Battery Park City in 1981, you may have said it was a failure, John. But I think today you'd say, okay, great. They parceled out sites to developers and it was successful. So I think it's also, what's the right time horizon to look at projects of this scale? Because I think they need to get measured in decades, if not longer in some instances. Like California High-Speed Rail, what's the right time horizon for thinking about a project of that scale? Is it really 10 or 15 years, or is it like 50 or 100 years? And I think projects of this scale sometimes require really even widening out further to think about when we hit the stop on the time frame in which we measure a project, and what's the right way to do that? Because I think when we measure a project also can, I think, overly cloud how we see a project, right? That's my point about looking at Battery Park City in 1981 before any building had been built, but lots of public money had been spent on parks and streets. So just a few thoughts to maybe not challenge, but to put a different perspective on the conversation.
Thank you, Raju. And I think there's a question in the Q&A list that I think actually kind of responds in some ways to what you're talking about with respect to you mentioned that the promise of low-income housing in Battery Park City could not be kept in 1982, and I think that this questioner says, in essence, these negotiations will always require that developers are seeking a substantial return. What are the ways to assess how much return the developers are making and what is considered appropriate return on investment for public amenities like housing, parks, schools, et cetera? And, I think that the question of whose priorities were foregrounded in 1982 is one that that's not necessarily something that is there's not an automatic sort of answer to the question of like how much should what kind of return on investment should there be in a project which is getting a lot of subsidy, which the city is enabling through all kinds of legal means as well. So I wonder if anybody on the panel wants to kind of probe that a little bit, and I see that your hand is up, John, so I will go ahead and cede the floor to you. John, you're muted.
I never begrudge developers their profits. They're the ones taking the risks. They're the ones raising the capital. But it's not part of their mission statement or job to make sure the public benefits are realized. Their primary interest will always be in the public benefits that serve their marketing purposes the most. So it's easier to ask them to do something like a waterfront park than it is, let's say, to have ground floor industrial use in a multiple story building. So I wouldn't, the question becomes, is the agency in charge of P3 doing an analysis such that the developer who will make all sorts of cases why it's absolutely necessary that they be off the hook on this or that, and why they need this or that additional revenue stream. And so it requires the capacity of the agency to be as smart as the developer. I have a colleague, the smartest planner I know, named Ken Bowers, who says that's impossible because agencies have multiple purposes and developers have single purpose and pay better. So they'll always be smarter when it comes to figuring out those finances. Maybe, but they don't have to be smarter, just has to be smart enough. I think the question of promises goes less to the question of what's in phase one, which I agree with Moses. That's part of, and if you will, the ground cost or the public subsidy. And building a waterfront park, let's say, is $20 million. That's $20 million that would normally come out of the ground cost if it was, let's say, obligated under zoning, or $20 million that's negotiated between the developer and the agency controlling the P3. That if it's in phase one, it's guaranteed. If it's after phase one, it's speculative just for the reasons that Raju brought up. So it's that speculative reason that I don't count on the developer to do it. I count on the public sector to do it. The public sector is ultimately the one that by putting it in there promised it. And if the public sector doesn't think the money will come forward, then it will actually do a better job at explaining that and building that into the process. The main success to me of Battery Park City is not its history. I mean, there's broken promises there too, as Raju highlighted. The main element of success I felt was that the authority in the city, or the authority and the state, which was a state creation, right, Raju? The authority? That the authority kept control of the entire project. And as market conditions improved, that park became spectacular and a citywide asset, which I don't think was part of the original vision. They just thought of it as the best of New York, not as, the equivalent to Brooklyn Bridge Park in Manhattan. I believe that the authority is once again contributing to affordable housing fund. So that promise, now the market conditions have improved. The fact that the market changes is indeed one of the reasons why I keep saying phase one should be the only one that's approved. Because markets will go down and we have to revisit what promises are made. In all reality, markets go up, like what happened at Battery Park City, and we could expect more if we wanted.
Anybody else want to respond to John or the?
I just want to just say one thing that I guess what I'm struggling with here a little bit is that, is there a world where the evolution of projects to reflect changes makes sense as opposed to the broken promises framing? I think, again, Battery Park City is an example, went through 3 different urban design master plans before it kind of landed in a sort of neo-traditional context in the mid-'80s. But the early plans, I think those are promises I'm happy were broken, because if you look at those early plans, they were huge, large-scale urban renewal buildings that spanned 5 or 6 blocks without sidewalks or streets in between them. So I think the framing of broken promises describe the evolution of projects we need to be careful of. Now, in the affordable housing context or the public space context, understood that those are clear commitments that are of significant public value. But I do think that projects evolve and change, and we have to just make sure we're keeping room for that in the kind of discussion around how do we allow neighborhoods over time to evolve, because the scale of what we're talking about is the scale of neighborhood. Now, again, I'm not trying to sound apologetic for places where a certain public benefit was promised and it wasn't delivered. Again, I think that those are real challenges around project delivery and making sure we think through a project the right way at the beginning of a project, so that the delivery of the project can actually flow from there, and that promises aren't sketches, they're understood as how they might get delivered in the context of a project. But I guess I'm just trying to introduce some other perspective around evolution of cities and neighborhoods too, and how do we account for that in our thinking about broken promises? Because I think at least Battery Park City had multiple master plans that were not built when finally the sort of mid-'80s neo Upper West Side version was.
I'd agree.
And I know you have something to say, but Liz,
yeah.
did you also want to respond?
Yeah, I wanted to recenter the role of government here and the fact that government is supposed to serve the people, right? Like in ESD's approval of the Penn Station redevelopment, they we at Reinvent Albany, we worked with the Schwartz Center at the New School and got Bridget Fisher and Flavia Elite, who were great researchers, to do an analysis of the project, because ESD didn't do one, right? And they found that even in the best case economic scenario, everything runs on time. There's rainbows and bunnies in Penn Station, right? that the developer would get 1.2 billion in tax breaks. Now that wasn't anything that government said would that ESD released to the public. We were never even told that's what would happen. And even then it was like a best case scenario of everything running on time so that like the developer, the development would eventually, the TIF district that they're proposing would pay back into itself, right? And that would only mean that Vornado is financing 55% of the development there, right? The rest is coming from the state. And you see this again with this like Micron investment near Syracuse in Clay, New York. Like the governor's going around saying that Micron is making $100 billion investment in Clay, but they've not given any money. Meanwhile, the state is rolling over to like give them all kinds of, express subsidies and just like throwing money at Micron, claiming we're going to get it back in this $1 billion investment. But it's, we've not seen a penny of it in New York State. But you know what? Governor Hochul had a great moment with her hard hat on and her shovel in the sand, and she was able to prove that she was doing something, right? So I think like what the developer is telling us is one thing, but it's like, how is this information digested and presented to the public? And what is ESD promising on our behalf as taxpayers to that developer? I think that's really important here.
And I think, Liz, that this relates to a question by Assemblywoman Simon about the level of public capital in projects. I do remember seeing some independent budget office reporting on Atlantic Yards that was not particularly favorable in terms of what kind of return the public was getting on its investment, even purely from if you only were thinking of public benefit as consisting of revenue. And I think there is a lot of something that happens happening more and more with large projects is that pilot agreements are being negotiated, which end up having generating revenue that is far smaller or far less than what would be happening if buildings and land were being assessed at their, assessed as the Department of Finance usually assesses land and buildings and regular property taxes were getting paid. So I'm not sure what why it is that when we have a mega project, we're sort of privileging the return or the sponsor of the project, except that it is probably just often a single counterparty that the ESD is negotiating with, and there's sort of nobody else to provide a competitive solution that might be better for the city and state. And I think that was something that Moses, you mentioned the other day, and perhaps you'd like to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Assemblywoman raises a very good point, which is if the purpose of these projects is to throw off tax revenue, but the only way you get them billed is through a gigantic tax incentive, what's the point, kind of? And I think that's something we run into with the mega projects. I think it's something also, quite honestly, we run into in affordable housing and mixed income housing developments. And I think that there is a very obvious reason for it. And then there's also, maybe I'm being too optimistic, a very obvious solution. So the city will always want to do a tax exemption because they feel like it's the easiest subsidy that they can control, and they don't really have to pay for it right now, right? It's not reliant on federal money. It doesn't have a lot of strings. You can just give a tax exemption, and you also don't have to dig into this year's budget to do it. The problem and the trade-off is from just a financial perspective, that dollar 30 years from now is worth 27 cents today, maybe, in terms of development incentive, but it's still $1 off your budget in the future. So you really are, through these long extended tax exemption programs, sacrificing the future stability of the city's budget for a little bit of ease and budgetary consideration today. The biggest solution, and this is something, I've always been a proponent of for thinking about the affordable housing or the mixed income housing tax exemptions, and also I think is a very good policy for the mega projects, is just put an assessed value cap on the exemption, which means that, okay, you need an exemption to make this work. How much do you need? We figure it out. If this project does super well and now your project is worth twice as much money as we'd underwritten for, you don't get the exemption on that extra value. You then start to pay taxes on that extra value that was unanticipated and wasn't part of the thinking behind the original construction of the plan. I mean, this is something developers don't like because developers feel they're taking the risk, and if they hit the home run, they should get all the upside. But if you're in a public-private partnership, the public is a big part of that, and the public also deserves some of the upside if you hit a home run. So I think that that's, a way that you can think about structuring pilots or tax incentives. That's a much better way of doing it.
And Moses, are you also, the other day you mentioned that you thought it was too often that there was just one counterparty, or that city should put, or the state should do more RFPs in which development teams had the opportunity to sort of, in a sense, compete for public subsidy by offering better returns for the public, and then the state would make a decision.
I think obviously the more competitive the process, the better it is for the public. I mean, that is, I think a fairly evident solution. The problem often comes where you have a market that, folks aren't really interested, or it's new, or it's complicated, you don't get a lot of bids. Then maybe the market improves or somebody figures something out and you get one bid, and you kind of jump on that one bid or that one person you can negotiate with, instead of maybe waiting a little bit, seeing if the market improves even more, seeing if other people figure out what the first person figured out, and having a little patience to get that competition and get those extra bids. That even, if you have two legitimate bidders who want a project, that is all, that really does serve to drive the public benefit. So, that is what I'd say. It might be the case that the public or the agency thinks a project is really marginal, thinks they're not ever going to be in a situation where they're going to get that kind of competition and figure it out with a single developer. And I can think of times that that's worked, arguably, and I can think of a lot of times that hasn't worked. And so just that trade-off and that patience and getting into a situation where you have a little more leverage as the public agency, I think is a key thing.
Great, thank you. Kind of looking ahead at our next case of promised public commitments, the Brooklyn Marine Terminal project. James DeFilippis asked a question about that project and the general project plan that is going to happen through ESD, and what should the board of that development corporation do? What kind of options do they have to ensure that public benefits are realized? Including, I think there has been a fair amount of emphasis again on affordable housing as part of this project, I think it's a great question to contemplate, because there's we're still at the ideation phase for the development corporation and for the project plan and the agreement. Is this a possible place in which to pilot some of your ideas, John, about approval at each phase, and the public sector guaranteeing the benefits if the developer doesn't provide them?
Yes. However, that would require going back to ULURP. Right now, having the state be the legal entity that is doing the project means that it's a general purpose plan, and everything that's gone wrong in Atlantic Yards can go wrong again here. And as with Atlantic Yards, I think there's promises being made with no path to implement them in the project. Atlantic Yards promising the affordable housing on the most expensive land to create, the overbuild, was, perhaps sincere, like we hope we'll be able to pull it off. I think it actually was, knowing a little bit about the development team. But that development team is now long gone. And the numbers never worked to begin with, so they still don't work. And it's the same thing going on at Brooklyn Marine Terminal, where essentially every major stakeholder was promised something. The cost is well over $1 billion. And it's not clear that, certain things are really capable of happening. Like, could you really have a shipyard next to luxury housing? Can you have luxury housing on a platform in a neighborhood that's underwater because there's no way to save Red Hook? I could keep going. So my fear with Brooklyn Marine Terminal is actually that if Atlantic Yards, I think, was let's get the most money for MTA, and we think we got it right with this legal requirement for a penalty fee and with this community benefits agreement and this and that, but the fundamentals of the deal didn't work, overrided those. And my fear is the same thing is happening with BMT. And it should really go back. It's a big project with huge implications for the entire maritime and industrial sector of New York, as well as huge implications for resiliency. And to me, it's a citywide issue that needs full citywide debate in order to create a plan that's better. So, yes, we could pick and choose from the 6 that are still, alive. Like, each phase has to go through a new GPP, because that would be what it would be called for here. But I think that would just yield confusion. We should go back to start and do it the right way with Euler. And the other things I suggested.
If that stipulating that probably won't happen, what is your advice for the trustees of the development corporation that is being formed right now?
City guarantees, not the developer. The city guarantees all the public benefits. And with exceptions, they're all in phase 1. And that there's a true feasibility look at the site being entirely maritime, as the borough president has called for, rather than the supposition which EDC made. And then finally, and actually, I think this is where you start.
Wait, what was the supposition?
Oh, sorry. The other panelists know this. I'm getting over a six-day fever, so I'm a little cloudy still. The supposition that there's limited need or demand for the maritime uses, and then we can accommodate them. The ones we already have contracts with can be accommodated in this way, as opposed to looking at it from a hard point of view. For example, the maritime, it's not clear that it would be protected from climate change. So does it have a shelf life of only 30 years, or is it intended to be a permanent use of the site? It's absolutely clear that the housing is going to object to every time there's a 3 a.m., noise. Is this really something we want to set up? My fear is that there's a passion for getting as many thousands of units built as announced as soon as possible, and that was the real driver for the project, rather than being realistic about what is the mix of uses, what is the real resiliency story, et cetera. But to answer your question about what you could do now, one is there's only a GPP for each phase. There's a sketch plan, but it's understood it has to come up again for a full review process for every stage of the way. Two, that there's immediate and total transparency about what the real infrastructure costs are. Because I suspect this is Willets Point all over again. Willets Point is close to $480,000 per unit. So is this another example of a boondoggle? That we'll count the units and disregard the costs. Three, there's easily over $1 billion worth of infrastructure involved. What is that for? I think it's overwhelmingly for the housing and not for the maritime, even though it's described as being for the maritime or just being lumped together. There's just lots of things that don't make sense or are kind of confusing, and getting information, the community getting information has been like pulling teeth. This is not the lack of transparency, to me, communicates a weakness of argument. You're transparent if you're confident in your numbers. You're transparent if you're confident in your arguments. When you're not transparent, it means either you're hiding something or you're not confident, or you're manipulating.
I would also add to your sort of questioning of certain suppositions, a question about the supposition that a project with purported regional benefits, which is taking trucks off highways and being the whole Blue Highways element, it has regional benefits, but it has to pay for itself, which is part of what's been said about the housing, that we need the revenue from the housing in order to pay for the rehabilitation of the maritime piece. And I think that's also questionable.
And I would use Willets Point as an example, which is the billions of dollars that's going into Willets Point is the same as what will happen here. And there won't be money left over for the maritime. There's, I think, something like $200 million in infrastructure dollars already available for the maritime. And there's other weird things, by the way, which is part of my whole reason for saying this needs to be with a comp plan and needs to be deliberate and needs to have controversies. There's a rumored promise of several $100 million for the public housing, which I would assume would go largely to fix problems that have existed for some time, including a asthma epidemic that, in my eye, is as egregious as water in Flint. And the idea that the housing authority, and city, is coming up with the money only in exchange or in connection with a private development, a P3 project, to me is an abrogation of the responsibility of government to the health and welfare of its citizens.
So I want to see if any of the other panelists have advice for the incoming development corporation that's going to be leading things at the Brooklyn Marine Terminal. Anybody want to take that on? Going once.
I'll take it on. I think I'm tired of hearing about communities being forced to feel okay with losing, either via dispossession or displacement. And it's all about, in my mind, the capitalist whims of developers who don't care about communities and all that. And so I would just encourage them to be true to themselves and to the community and to demand great things, right? Because New Yorkers deserve great things all over the state, right? And we should not have to bow down to these developers and, or these like state entities who come into our city acting like bullies, right? That's not the way this is supposed to be, right? And I just to go back to something John said earlier about having a city plan, right? I think Mayor like Mamdani wants to have one, which I think is great. And you said that right now the mayor rules because there is not a city plan. I think it's also like the mayor and the developers rule, right? Because the developer sticks around for much longer than a mayor does, right? And I think along with that, in terms of re-envisioning how we do planning in cities all over the state, if we're talking about New York City specifically, I think I'm not so rosy on ULURP, right? I think there's problems with ULURP. I think it is our democratic process in the city that we have. But I do think it does encourage some amount of NIMBYism, right? And when that happens, then the state is even more invigorated to come in and quash that process, right? And the city will sometimes even invite the state in to say, like, you know, you looked at this with the Columbia Manhattanville case, right? They wanted to just go through ULURP and the community board was not into it. So then Columbia was like, well, why don't we just get our friends at ESD to come in and eminent domain all this stuff, and then we can put up these glassy buildings and do what we want, right? And so I think there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen. And now I feel like I'm going off on a rant, but I will say to the people who are working on the Brooklyn Marine Terminal, I just like have high expectations, right? Hold state entities accountable, hold government elected officials accountable, hold developers accountable. Just like, be strong because we can't afford to lose anymore in the city, right? It's over, right? We're over it. So yeah, that's all I gotta say. Thank you.
Somebody Eli Gottlieb is pointing out that there are some important differences between Atlantic Yards and the BMT project, and the BMT project is a little bit closer to the Battery Park format because there's not there's the potential for there to be multiple developers. I don't know if Raju, maybe you might want to speak to that question, and what might you advise the BMT Development Corporation from your perch?
I mean, I think it's really, really important, as I was trying to say earlier, to I think look at the context for which these projects sit in across the country and across the world, really, that these mega projects really do struggle with the same issues. If we can zoom out from a local perspective to understand that delivering projects of this scale and complexity over decades is really hard. I don't think we say that often enough. It's really, really hard. And so I think learning from the other projects that are challenged to keep to schedule, to keep to cost, and understand what the effective project management of the projects has been for projects that have is really important. And I know that's, again, maybe overly a technocratic answer for a conversation where there's a little more frustration about the state of state of play and the state of development. But I think it's really important that if you don't have the right people who are equipped to deliver these projects, then the promises aren't going to happen. They're just not going to happen. And so you need to have really experienced managers of complicated infrastructure projects. And so I think what I would advise, the community and the BMT folks is making sure that they staff up with the kind of staff that's going to be able to think through all of the questions John was raising and really have a credible and clear answer. And not just a convenient answer, but a credible and clear answer. And that'd be my biggest piece of advice, I think, is just you got to find the right people who I think both believe in the project and also are prepared to deliver on it and have the background to deliver on it. Because again, promises on paper don't make things so. People do, and you have to have the right people to make it so.
Just to push back a little bit, I don't know if you start from the idea that a project has to happen and then you're trying to figure out how to deliver it. I think that you might be starting a few steps ahead of where you might have started, which is, is this project serving the public, and does it need to happen before we decide how we're going to staff it up? So I think what would you say to the question of how to determine what projects are absent having a comprehensive plan, which I think is a great idea, but we've tried it a lot, and I'm very hopeful that maybe there will be a comprehensive plan under the next mayor. But absent that, how should we decide what projects need to be delivered in the first place?
Sorry, I may have misunderstood the question. Then I thought the question was about what advice would I give folks working on the BMT project.
No, that's true.
So apologies. So how do we decide on the projects we want to build? I mean, that's a deep question about what does democracy look like, and how do we make decisions. I don't think this is that different than how do we choose what legislation to pass or what goes in the budget. I think these are questions of how do we structure our city to make decisions, and we've got certain processes in place today That's how we've chosen to structure them. And so what those processes produce is the decisions we've collectively decided upon, even if we disagree with them. We can restructure it, as I think some folks have suggested on this panel, but that requires political will to do that too. But then that's a different way of choosing priorities. But I can give you a planning answer for what I think, but I think it's really about how do we make decisions about the future of the city, whether it's legislative or budget or planning and development or infrastructure. And I think we have processes in place today to do that. And the outcome is the outcome of the construct we've set up. And we debate and we argue about what's right or not. But I think if we think a new construct is going to change outcomes, I'm less convinced of that, frankly. I think it's really informed people, really engaged elected officials, really healthy debate. I think that is more likely to change outcomes. We all know the sort of turnouts in primaries of city council or state elected races are in the teens sometimes in terms of level of participation. So I think it's there has to be a bigger and deeper engagement among many more people for outcomes to shift. I don't think simple like legislative approaches gets us all the way there. I think people have to decide they care enough about this and that this is enough of a problem that they want to get engaged. And it'll be interesting, I think that the ballot measure that was put on the charter the reform around changing the election cycle, and Moses or John or others can correct me if I'm getting this wrong, to make the mayoral cycle at the same time as the presidential cycle was actually defeated. Um, and so it's interesting, the people who voted in New York said, no, we'd rather have an off-cycle mayoral election where turnout is going to be lower than a presidential election. And that was the choice voters made. And I kind of scratched my head at that one. I didn't totally fully understand sort of the pros and cons. I hadn't done a lot of homework on it, but when the voters were given an option to choose more participation, they chose to keep it in the current scheme it is. So, again, I don't want to get too philosophical here, but I think there's no substitute for education and engagement to get more people involved in these conversations to then help shift outcomes, whether it's, again, a land use debate about land guards, or it's a debate about the budget, or it's a debate about, a piece of legislation.
Moses, you haven't waited on this, so I'm going to put you on the spot. But what, if you were a member of the VMT Development Corporation, what would your focus be on?
I have to sit this one out because we're on, RPA as an entity is on uh, the committee, not me personally, but I don't want to speak for the person on the committee or RPA or anything like that. I can't say personally I am familiar with it, but I don't think I am in the details well enough to comment on the proposal specifically. I'd love to talk, a little bit more to Raju's point about engagement and how it works. And I think, he's very correct. And it really is a trade-off of broad but perhaps like a little more casual involvement versus fewer people, but with a lot more intense involvement. And that, I think, is what came off in the charter revision debate. The counterpoint to having presidential election years was, well, if you have the president getting elected at the same time as the mayor, won't the mayoral race kind of get lost in the shuffle and not get the attention it really deserves? Because it's going to be down ticket, whereas in an off election year, the mayoral election is at the head of the ticket. And so the media and the public really focus on it a lot more. I am a big fan of trying to get a lot more broad casual engagement in the city in these kind of projects, and I think it yields really good results. And I will point again to the world, to listening to the city in the example of the World Trade Center, and I think that that has yielded something through a lot of broad casual engagement, or even the Battery Park City is another example. Than a lot of the mega projects where you've had fewer people, but folks who are very intensely invested in one thing or another, kind of playing that public role a little bit more. John has some comments about that.
No, you're not going to jump in, John.
The I've worked on some of these mega projects for the city as their consultant. And I agree with Raju about staffing. We want EDC to be as smart as they actually are. City planning has, compared to its counterparts around the country, 1/4 the staff of in proportion to population is, let's say, Chicago. So the city planning department has one hand tied behind its back in terms of capacity to do things. There's a lot that could be done on the staff, but I don't think it is a question of do we have sincere or smart people working on these projects. I um I think it's the question of the interests line up in a certain way, and that we need to change those fundamentals to do the types of things that Moses is talking about. So I want to take a punch, if you will. You know, the 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 opinion I keep hearing among people who behind the scenes are influencers within government is that communities are definitionally NIMBY. They should not be listened to, that the only people who show up are the homeowners, and that the renters are therefore their interests are being discounted. And it's a whatever it takes moment. People will be grateful in the end for what is happening. And the development community is only too eager to promote this because it aligns with their long-term interest in freeing up more sites and lowering the cost of sites for development and being able to proceed more. And I would argue that it's that type of thinking that creates a situation like Atlantic Yards. Whatever it takes to get the MTA money, that's what counts. That was what the MTA project director told me when I asked him years later what was their thinking. He said, only one thought. What was the maximum amount of units we can get there for the maximum number of revenue? And I think it's a similar issue going on generically with EDC. And they're only accountable to the mayor. And the mayor's term of office is over in, let's say 3 to 7 years from that moment. So it's okay to overpromise and underdeliver because that's not the point even. So, and it's okay because communities are inherently NIMBY to overpromise or manipulate or not be transparent, because otherwise we're just playing into NIMBY hands. So I think the education, that Raju is referring to is not the idea that somehow we become Athens at, 8.5 million people. We're the size of Ireland. I think it's more that we design systems with checks and balances and accountability. And right now, for mega projects, there really isn't any accountability.
But John,
and Moses, what the example of World Trade Center, the whole world's eyes were on World Trade Center.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen for BMT, Atlantic Yards, Essex Crossing, Cooper Square Urban Renewal Area, Broadway Triangle. We can't have that type of 3 year, and it was practically 3 years, and it wasn't just the RPA. There was New York New Visions, there was the issue of all the survivors, and yet in the end of the day, the person who ran it for the state told me it's the governor's decision.
Yeah, and but John, I think that you're getting at my main point,
Okay.
which is what is community and who is invested in a project. And I think that the pushback comes when the idea of community and who is invested in a project is narrow geographically, narrow demographically, when you have that narrowness. You're right that the whole world's eye was on World Trade Center, and you're right that ultimately the governor made the call. And this is my point. The governor is a representative of New York State accountable to a very broad constituency. The entire city showed up. I wasn't living anywhere near the World Trade Center, but I was invested in the vision of it. And I will say the public chose the least NIMBY option available. The public very, very specifically said, we want the tallest building in the world at this site. I can
Right.
think of nothing less NIMBY that could happen. So this is really my point. When you say, well, that's not going to happen with the Brooklyn Marine Terminal or an Essex Crossing. I mean, maybe not if we don't try, but number one, I think that we have had a lot more interest in urban planning over the last 2 decades since I've started my career. That's grown, and I think people are more invested in place and design and results than they outside of maybe their immediate neighborhood than they were. And I think that we can get folks even more involved in that. And you have lots of publications that are dedicated to New York City. You have lots of interest. You have lots of nonprofits. When at the same time the World Trade Center was going on, Open House New York started, which is probably the most popular civic association in New York in terms of the amount of people who engage with it. So I think that that we can get that type of broad engagement for a lot of our mega projects.
I'm a
We are
Pratt
coming up
fan. I
on
agree with
time.
you.
And I want to thank everybody. I didn't get to even half of the audience questions or comments here, but this was a really interesting discussion and dialogue. And I want to end it with two kind of reminders. One being where we started. I again regret that April Baskin was not here because I think everyone in this audience would have really enjoyed meeting her and learning the story of how she came to propose this state entity, which Liz is not too excited about, but which is a real attempt to kind of get beyond this dilemma that seems to really recur, in which public commitments get made and then sort of scuttled, and there's not any recourse. A couple people in the question and answer were talking about, is there a legal recourse, and if a CBA is not if there's not compliance, then what kinds of legal options does the community have? And so I think these are interesting questions to contemplate, and I think that it's so very exciting to see at least one state legislator taking those on, and I would love to continue. And I also think it's great to have to get beyond the bubble of New York City, right? Because it turns out these things are happening in Buffalo and causing consternation, in Buffalo as well. So I think, I really think would be interesting to engage a variety of state legislators who have dealings with various public authorities, probably most often the ESD, and solicit their sense of what might, what might make a difference.
ESD blacklisted me a long time ago, so don't ask me to get in touch with them.
The other thing that came up over the course of this conversation is that we do have a mayor starting January 1st who has pledged to do some comprehensive planning. And there was someone in the Q&A from ANHD, Association of Neighborhood and Housing Development, noted that they were forming a coalition around that. And I think that could be the very kind of democratic participation, small d, that Raju and Moses kind of lifted up. if we really did have to sit down and talk about what the priorities are, kind of citywide, then we wouldn't have a situation where members of the city council were kind of negotiating stormwater infrastructure at the 11th hour, in exchange for their vote. At that, I think I'm going to toss it back to you, Gib, to sort of close us out. But again, thanks everybody who was here on, Monday night, and this has been really interesting, and I hope that we have the opportunity to do some follow-up conversations on this topic.
Thank you, Laura. I will say for my part, I can't imagine 5 people who I would more enjoy listening to talk about the challenges of planning in the city of New York. And for my part, I was really listening very carefully to this to kind of put as many pieces together in the context of where we are with Atlantic Yards as I could. But there are a couple of things that emerged that I just wanted to mention. First of all, really appreciated Raju's call to engage the public fully. I also believe this is a very critical part of accomplishing anything in New York City relative to planning. I believe the call to favor competition and avoid single source projects is very, very important. Not particularly easy to turn back in the case of Atlantic Yards, maybe some more opportunity there with BMT. The idea that you have the right people overseeing the project at the government level is something that I think is an important success criteria that unfortunately we haven't really had at Atlantic Yards in its single source structure. And the call to approve in phases rather than to have a long multi-year UDC approval that can be evergreen and continue to be changed over time is very good advice. And then finally, I think one of the things I found most compelling is the idea that we have to make sure the project is feasible. There's no promises that are made are going to work out if the project fundamentally isn't going to work on the numbers. And that I think is something we've also learned at Atlantic Yards, and hopefully it's a lesson that other projects like BMT can learn from. So having said all of that, I would once again like to thank our moderator, Laura Wolf-Powers, our panelists, Moses Gates, Elizabeth Marcello, John Shapiro, Raju Mann, and on behalf of our sponsors, the Brooklyn Speaks Coalition, Voices of the Waterfront, and the City Club of New York, thank you all for joining us this evening, and we look forward to continuing the discussion in the days ahead. Have a good night and enjoy the holidays.